It's a bit early for me still, but I'll try to manage. So my name is Simen. I come from Schibsted, and I don't have all these cool videos, I'm sorry, but there was a lot of them, so maybe we can manage with some boring slides. I can start a little bit about myself. So my name is Simen. I worked as a data scientist in sort of the Schibsted ecosystem for a long time now. Previously, I worked for Finn, and now I sort of moved over to the mother company, which is called Schibsted, where I lead this AI enablement program. I also have like a side gig, which is a PhD in recommender systems. That is never ending, but that's not the main focus right now. So what is Schibsted? So it's much easier. It was much easier when I was still employed in Finn, because that's much easier to explain. But Schibsted is basically sort of the owner of Finn. So we work with Finn, but we also work with a lot of other companies. So I think like Schibsted consists of, well, if you ask the top executives in Schibsted, like how many brands are we? They don't really know. They think like maybe we're about 50 different companies. And this is how we like to portray us as a shopping mall with all these different brands. So you have Finn.no, which I previously worked, but you also have like the news media, like VG, Aftenposten, and then we have similar sites in Sweden, for instance, like Blocket, Aftonbladet. So we have a big like Scandinavian media and marketplace presence. Sort of common for all of this is like we're platforms. Like we are usually with a lot of users and a lot of content. So I think like that's sort of my common denominator between all these different companies. Right. Okay, a little bit more boring slides. So the AI enablement program. So what am I doing every day? So we are a small team, and our task is basically to get more AI in Schibsted. And we do this in many different ways. We don't really own anything. Like we don't own code, and that's not the purpose of what we should do. Like we should be there to enable the existing teams to use AI. So we work with VG, we work with the news media, with the marketplaces to sort of enable them to use AI in their products. And we do this through upskilling. We had like 500 employees now through our sort of AI academy, and like 100 of them actually like went through like this full-on, I think it's like a 10-week university light course. So think like 8 credits with a project in the end. So that means like there's a lot of people in Schibsted and developers in Schibsted that are really keen to learn more on this. We also do like internal consultancy. We run around and we sort of help people where they have missing black spots for where to work with AI, and we sort of try to enable them to do more of it. All right. Just like the previous speaker, I was invited before the responsible was into the topic of today. So I will not speak too much about responsible AI. And also, I mean, Schibsted, we're a huge, chaotic company. So there's a lot of things I will not have time to speak on, but I will speak on some bits of Schibsted. And I think like one thing that is really important for us is personalization. So as I said, like we're a company, or we have a lot of platforms. Platforms have a lot of users and they have a lot of content. And it's impossible to sort of manually curate, or for every user to read all the content on each platform. So that's the one problem. And it's impossible for us to curate what every user should see. So how do we solve it? Well, one way to solve it is through personalization. And I think like it's just impossible for me as a user to read everything. So we have to have some kind of filtering so you can sort of get the most relevant items. Traditionally, that would be like the editors in the news media who decided, and still is to a main degree, that would decide what you should see. But maybe now, and in the marketplaces particularly, like there is a need for personalization. And we are now competing with social media. I think there was one teenager I spoke to, she said like that she got most of like Facebook. No, I don't use Facebook, or I just use it for news. And when you work in an editorial company like that, all the alarms goes ringing, right? Like you don't want to use Facebook. Like you shouldn't be your main source of news because it's not a news site. So that's what we're competing against. Right, so I think personalization in Schibsted started not in news media. It started in Finn, and I think Finn launched their first sort of recommender system product in 2009. And it's been a long journey, and sort of making that journey very short. Now, like the total consumption of personalization on Finn and recommender systems is about 20% of the total site. So it's an important part of the site. And this way more difficult topic of personalizing news media, that's like what we are tackling now. It's hard because like you shouldn't just go straight to personalization, give everyone exactly what they want, because there's some common stories that everyone should see. You should be getting opposing views, you should be challenged on your views and so on. So it's actually like a much harder problem to solve than like find the most relevant cars that you might want to buy tomorrow, like we do on Finn, because there's less ethics and bias in that. But when we do this, I mean, there's some stories that is probably quite okay to personalize. So if we go here, like on Aftenposten, so yeah, maybe like this top story here, when I grabbed it, is about the Samic people and the reindeer and windmill debate that we just had. And maybe that's something everyone should read, right? But there is stuff here that are probably completely fine to personalize. So we have, I think we have like Oslo Guide stuff, like parents' advice. I mean, these things are less risky to sort of, maybe, okay, I'm not a parent, maybe I don't need parent advice articles. That doesn't interest me. I can get something else. So the initial results here is really good. And like sort of these simpler recommender systems here, I have one example, which is not from VG, Simen, I'm sorry. But we see that like people respond well to it. We get like 10% increase with fairly simple algorithms, 10% increase in sort of the reads on our sites, which is huge if you're into getting people enjoying your site. Yeah, and as I said, it's just too much information, and you need to sort of help the user to navigate your site. So one big problem in recommender systems is the cold start problem. And I think for news and marketplaces, like we have it even more than anyone else. Okay, so first, what's the cold start problem? So sort of very crash course to recommender systems. So usually recommender systems, like the best recommender systems, they don't need the content of the items they're recommending. So they just look on patterns. So they see like, okay, 10 people clicked at this item, but they also sort of consume this item. So maybe there's a link. So like the people who looked at this should, but haven't looked at this one yet, they should probably, we should probably recommend this other thing to them. And that works like surprisingly well. That's sort of the very, like that principle works really well. But it doesn't really work well when we have few sort of interactions on the items. And so then what we do? So here we have like a Finn ad with someone selling their taekwondo belts, newly published. And our sort of collaborative filtering algorithm that sort of uses this principle tries to recommend similar stuff. And this is what it recommends. Doesn't make sense. Like, well, it does kind of make sense. So what can you see here? Well, we can sort of see, so this is kids' taekwondo belts. And you can see, okay, you get women's shoes. Okay, it's probably mothers looking at these karate belts. But like, there's like maybe 10 clicks on this. So like, that's the pattern it managed to figure out. But that's the wrong pattern. Like, it's obvious it's the wrong pattern. And then you get some kid stuff, which is like, okay, I can get that, but it's wrong. And sort of what's happening is like it's different. So, well, in this generative AI, like everyone starting working on embedding spaces, and recommender system is all about embedding spaces. And like what is these models are not able to do is that like we have to sort of place all the items in this sort of hyperspace, and that's not what we're able to do when we have a few interactions on the data. So what do we do instead? well, we have to use the content. So then we have to use the content to solve this cold start issue. And when you do that, we can get much better recommendations. So here you can see, like, while sort of adding the text and images into the models, we can then more correctly recommend similar items to the user. And as I said, like Schibsted, like we have huge cold start issues. I mean, I didn't really realize how huge cold start issues we had before, like a couple of years ago. But I think like Netflix has 2,000 movies they're recommending. And on fin.no, like we have 2 issues. So we only sell, like, if you're going to sell your jeans, you're only going to sell that item once. That's one thing. And there's a lot of those items. So we have like 3 million active items on Finn at every time. And a pair of jeans may be active for a week. If you compare this to Komplett, I think they have 20,000 items that they sell like for many years on end, right? So that they can just gather up a lot of information on their content. We cannot. Similar for news media. I mean, the big problem with news media from a recommender systems point of view now, or a full cold start point of view, is that news are new. Like, what is relevant for you? Well, they don't have a lot of clicks yet. Like, it's only when they have a lot of clicks we can recommend them properly, but then they're not news anymore. So that's a big dilemma for us. And there is, like, too much news to consume. Everyone cannot consume everything, so there has to be some filtering here. And I mean, if you compare this to Netflix, who does like 2,000 movies, like that's a much simpler problem, I would say, than we have. And they have other problems, of course, but this is sort of our problem. And I think sort of the solution here, and sort of the solution we have been working on, is that you have to use these language models. You can use, like, we essentially have 2 different types of data. We have text and we have images. But working with these text models is much more efficient because it's much more lightweight. There is more information in sort of the description of the item than of the image. So that's like something we work a lot on. It's less structured than sort of tabular data. We have some tabular data, but actually, like the approach a lot of us are doing now is just like we just take the tabular data and we make it into sort of a free-form text, and then we use language models to process it instead. Which sort of, if you think of it from like the old school data science point of view, it's crazy, but that seems to work well, and it's much easier to work with. Right. That was personalization. And then it's like, I want to go a little bit on this generative AI, which I try. I have my small crusade here. I don't want to call it generative AI. I want to call it ready-to-use AI, because I think that's a big part of the revolution that's on it right now. Because this is really a democratization of AI in a way. And sort of what are these models doing? Well, the models are now like they're expanding. So one thing, they're expanding to a lot of more unstructured data. So they're able to do like free texts, they're able to do images, they're able to do speech and videos, right? Traditional data science and traditional machine learning models were more on tabular data. So like we're expanding into new domains, basically. But also, and maybe even more important, is that we now see these general purpose models like GPT-3, like the stable diffusion models. They are used, like you can train them once and they are then useful elsewhere. So you don't really need, you can just take the GPT-3 model and you can make it useful to something else without sort of fine-tuning it or retraining it in anything. And I think that's sort of one of the big revolutions that we've seen. Because this allows everyone to experiment with AI. And I think sort of one of the best examples I've seen of this is like these VG developers here. They were sitting around, it's like they heard about this new Whisper transcription model. It's like, oh, that sounds cool. What can we use it for? And then they realized that the journalists in VG are spending hours and hours to transcribe their interviews. And it's like, well, this is something this Whisper model can do. So they took the Whisper model without any knowledge of how the model worked, and they made an app out of it. They made like a proper app that can transcribe audio. And they made a server of it, and they made like a Mac app out of it. And this saves the journalists like enormous amounts of time, because now they can just sort of upload they just record the interview like they always do, and then they'll upload it to the service. And if they have they didn't know anything about the AI, but they were still able to sort of empower and save so much hours just on doing this. And this was 1,000 hours in 3 weeks, and then it's still exploding. And the journalists love it, because I mean that's sort of the boring work you want to do. Transcription is not why journalists are getting up in the morning. We have another example, Aftenposten, and we are sort of expanding this to all the different news brands. Is about sort of the other way around. So you have an article, text article on the web, and instead of reading it, you can actually now have it read to you. Same thing. This is generative AI, or ready-to-use AI. It's not completely ready to use, but it's quite ready to use. And you can get this voice of this woman. She read in 1,000 or some hours of text, and they cloned her voice. And I think this was, I think, a year ago, and now she would probably have to spend much less time to get the same results. And this has a huge impact on how our users are reading. We had people who are not good to read. They have ADHD, and they've been contacting this team saying whoa, this is great. I could never read the news. Now I can actually consume the news. So it's a super simple thing, but it has a big impact on how people can interact with our platform. And we also do a lot of other projects. We have a new summarizer. If you go to VG now, a lot of the articles, you can sort of get the short version. And currently, it's empowered by GPT-4. So the way they did this, also with fairly limited AI knowledge, right? There's no training involved. There probably will be at some point to improve it further. So you can get a short preview of what is this article. But you can also use this in different ways. So, I mean, VG is not only publishing on web, they're publishing on Snapchat, Instagram, I don't know, lots of different platforms. And there, in every platform, they need a slightly different text. And then you can use these kind of tools to sort of help you to get a first draft of this text. And sort of, what are sort of traditional data scientists doing now? Well, so one thing we found that these large language models, they're still hallucinating. So for one thing, I think it was 10% of all summaries do some hallucinations. So there's no way to sort of remove the human in the loop. So the way this is made is in the publication process, the journalist will generate the summary, but it also has to review or edit the summary before it ends up as this. But then sort of the data scientists, we can then try to sort of detect, it's a classification problem, essentially, right? Did this summary contain a hallucination? And if the probability is high enough from our models, well, then we can just generate a new summary and hope that this one does not generate a hallucination. And by this way, we can probably not remove the hallucinations, but at least we can reduce it to an acceptable level. But I mean, there's a lot of projects going out there. We also recently started this Nordic Instruct project, which is really a grassroots project, but this is us trying to see what can we do with this? Can we sort of build and fine-tune more LLMs for our products that we can use usefully? Can we build a chatbot? Is that something we want to do? Some of the projects here is also VG. VG is great, by the way, the developers in VG. If you ever get a possibility to work as a developer in VG, say yes, because those guys are great. And there's one now in our AI Academy who sort of made, he wanted to generate realistic VG titles. So in VG, they talk a lot about the X factor in creating titles. They're not clickbaity, but they're interesting and they're funny. Can we manage to get a model to do this? And GPT can't do it because it's too boring. So he sort of made, he tuned the model to, based on the article, get a good VG title. And it's nothing we use anything yet. I think it's like a preview tool for a journalist so they can play around with it. But I'd say it's pretty good, and it's pretty kind of cool to see these things popping up all over. Because, and sort of my end is like AI in Schibsted, it's chaos. I mean, I work for the enablement team. I try to sort of span everything, but it's not like we own it. And I think especially like after this generative AI ready-to-use revolution, it's just like popping up everywhere. Everyone is experimenting it. So it's sort of good chaos, I think. And it's so great to see a lot of people, like not necessarily AI experts, but like developers and just playing around with it and trying to incorporate it into the products. So yeah, that was my presentation. Thank you.